A man who pours every dollar into a clinic and still drives that same beat-up car?
Mom.
He'll die broke. And you deserve better than standing by and watching that happen.
Is that really what she thinks of me?
You can't keep wasting your life on a man like that.
The lawyer told me to wait a few more weeks.
Good. Don't let him find out too soon.
I know what I'm doing.
At least tell her she's wrong.
Was everything all right with the call?
Yes, the patient has been taken care of.
You were gone longer than I expected.
Only a few minutes. How are the preparations for your charity auction going?
Quite well. A lot of important people will be attending this year.
I hope the event is successful.
Are you all right?
I'm fine. Please, come in.
I didn't know this place belonged to you.
You never asked.
But 5 months later, she was the one sitting outside my office door waiting. The question is, what did she find when it opened? If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't bother to look closer, stay with me because this story is for you. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. I share stories like this one every week. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this story. I am not a man who talks about what he owns. I never have been. I drive the same SUV I bought nearly a decade ago, not because I can't afford something newer, but because it gets me from my house to the hospital and back, and that's all I've ever needed a car to do. I wear the same rotation of dress shirts. I leave before sunrise and I come home smelling like antiseptic. I am a cardiac electrophysiologist, which means my entire professional life is built around understanding what happens when the heart loses its rhythm, when the electrical system that keeps a person alive starts firing wrong, and the body that depended on it has no warning before it simply stops. That's the work. And I have always believed the work was enough. What I built around that work is a different story, and it's the story Rosalind Gaines never thought to ask about. Prairie Gate Heart and Rhythm Institute started as a single procedure room and an idea I'd been carrying since my residency. I opened the first location 2 years before I ever met Danielle. By the time we got married, Prairie Gate was already something real. 2 centers, a small team of specialists, a growing patient base across the Kansas City area. By the time Rosalind sat at that birthday dinner and decided she had me figured out, Prairie Gate had grown into 4 treatment centers, 3 outpatient procedure suites, and 13 physicians working across the region. Through a separate property company I'd structured before the marriage, I also owned 2 of the buildings the system operated out of. None of that was hidden. It was just never announced. The paperwork existed. The agreements were filed. The assets were real. I simply didn't feel the need to walk into family dinners and narrate my net worth between the soup course and the entree. That it turns out was a mistake Rosalind was happy to exploit. I had been married to her daughter Danielle for 8 years. When we first met, Danielle worked in brand strategy for a resort real estate company, sharp-focused someone who understood how to position things for an audience. That quality was one of the things I'd admired about her early on. She knew how to read a room. She knew what image communicated. What I didn't fully understand until much later was that she had eventually started applying that same lens to me, and what she saw didn't match the image she wanted to project. The men she worked around wore tailored suits and talked loudly about returns and portfolios. They drove cars that made statements. They treated money like a language everyone was supposed to hear. I didn't speak that language, and after a while, Danielle stopped trying to translate for me. Her mother had never tried at all. Rosalind Gaines lived on the Kansas side of the state line in a neighborhood in Mission Hills where the houses were maintained like arguments, immaculate, deliberate, designed to communicate standing. She was a widow involved in several charity boards, and she measured people the way some people measure real estate, by what they showed on the surface and how well they compared to the properties next door. In 8 years of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, Rosalind had made a quiet but consistent decision about me. I was a doctor, yes. But I was a doctor who drove the wrong car, lived in an old Tudor house in Brookside, that I was always tinkering with myself, and poured money into a clinic she assumed was barely keeping the lights on. She was cordial. She was never warm. And she had apparently been having a very different conversation with her daughter than the one I was present for. I found that out on the night of her 66th birthday. The dinner was at a restaurant near Country Club Plaza private room. Good wine, the kind of evening Rosalind preferred, because it allowed her to control who sat where and what the conversation circled back to. That night, the conversation kept circling back to Colin Vance. Colin was a wealth management advisor who worked with Danielle's company from time to time. He was a few years younger than me, the kind of man who looked expensive without you being able to name exactly what made him look that way, the cut of his jacket, the watch, the practiced way he talked about 8-figure transactions like they were mildly inconvenient. Rosalind had met him at a company event a few months prior and had apparently decided he represented a category of man that I did not. She brought him up 3 times before the main course arrived, each mention another brick in a wall she was building. I excused myself when my phone buzzed. One of my patients had gone into an abnormal rhythm, and the on-call team needed to loop me in. I stepped into the hallway outside the private dining room and handled the call. It took maybe 6 minutes. When I turned to walk back, the door was still open a few inches, and I heard Rosalind's voice before I heard anything else. She wasn't whispering. She said it to Danielle like a conclusion she'd reached after careful deliberation. A man who dumps every dollar into a clinic and still drives that same beat-up car, he'll die broke. And you deserve better than watching that happen. My wife's response was quiet, almost businesslike. She told her mother the lawyer had said to wait a few more weeks. Not that's not fair. Not you don't know what Xavier has built. Just wait a few more weeks. I stood there in the hallway for a moment. Then I walked back in, sat down, and finished my dinner. I asked Rosalind about the charity auction she'd mentioned earlier. I listened to her answer. I drove Danielle home afterward and said almost nothing because there was nothing to say that would have helped me then. 3 days later, I found the second phone. It was in the outer pocket of her laptop bag, a bag she'd left on the kitchen counter before heading upstairs. I wasn't going through her things. I was looking for a charging cable. The phone was face down and powered off, which is the kind of specific detail you don't think about until afterward when you realize powered off means she'd thought about it being found. I set it back exactly where it was and didn't touch it again. That same evening, I was passing through the living room when the family tablet on the coffee table lit up with an email notification. The subject line was visible before the screen locked. It was a calendar confirmation from a law firm that specialized in divorce proceedings and business asset division. I sat down on the couch and didn't move for a long time. Then I started checking the accounts. What I found took me the better part of 2 nights to trace fully, because it had been done carefully. Small amounts spread across 10 months described in transaction notes as consulting fees and investment preparation costs. When I added it all up, the total came to $64,800. The money had moved into an account connected to a financial advisory company that Colin Vance controlled. The transfer dates lined up with things I now understood differently. The business trips, the late meetings, the 2 weekend trips Danielle had taken with people she called friends. I sat at my desk in the room I'd converted into a home office, the same house I'd bought and renovated before we were married, where I'd rebuilt the basement into a library and put in a glass room at the back so my grandmother Bernice could sit and look at the garden in her last years, and I tried to understand the full shape of what I was looking at. Danielle wasn't just planning to leave me. She was involved with Colin, and she had been moving our shared money toward him for nearly a year. I understood then that what I did next would determine everything. The obvious move was to confront her, to walk upstairs, lay out what I knew, and demand answers. But I had spent enough time working through complex electrical systems to understand that the fastest intervention isn't always the right one. If I confronted Danielle that night, she would know I'd been through the accounts. She and Colin would have time to move whatever money remained, destroy communications, and build a version of events that served them before I had anything concrete to counter it. The risk wasn't just to the marriage, it was to Prairie Gate. The practice, the buildings, the 13 physicians and their teams, and the patients cycling through 4 treatment centers, All of it sat inside a legal structure that a contested divorce could threaten if the right pressure was applied at the right moment. I couldn't let that happen, so I made myself do the harder thing. I went back upstairs. I got into bed. And over the following days, I continued to share meals with my wife, answer her questions about my schedule, and carry myself through every conversation as though I had heard nothing in that hallway and found nothing in those accounts. It was one of the most difficult things I have ever done, not because I was still in love with the version of Danielle I thought I'd married, but because I was grieving her while sitting across from her at breakfast, and I couldn't let any of it show on my face. The only call I made was to Alicia Wynn. Alicia was an attorney I knew through Prairie Gate. She had helped two of my physician partners structure their shareholder agreements years earlier, so she understood the system's legal architecture better than almost anyone outside of it. She handled high-conflict divorces involving business assets, which meant she had seen exactly this kind of situation before. I reached her on a Tuesday evening and told her what I knew. I didn't frame it as a crisis. I told her I needed to protect the people who depended on Prairie Gate before any legal process had a chance to threaten them. Alicia's instructions were straightforward and non-negotiable. I was not to confront Danielle. I was not to move money restructure accounts or make any changes to Prairie Gate's financial operations. I was not to do anything that could later be characterized as hiding assets or preparing for litigation. What I was going to do was continue working, continue showing up, and let her build the documentation that would eventually determine how this ended. She said, "Your job right now is to keep doing what you've always done. Let the record speak." I told her I wasn't interested in revenge. I told her the only thing I wanted was to protect the patients, the staff, and everything I had built before this marriage existed. Alicia said that was the right answer, and then she went to work. I drove home that night, pulled into the garage of the house I had bought and rebuilt with my own hands, and sat in the dark for a while before going inside. The glass room at the back of the house was visible from the driveway if you knew where to look. I had built it for Bernice so she could sit in the warmth and watch the garden through the winter. She had been gone for 3 years. The chair she used was still there. I had never moved it. I thought about her that night. I thought about what she would have said if she'd known what was happening inside the house she'd loved. And then I thought about what Rosalind had said in that restaurant hallway, that a man like me would die broke, and I decided she was going to have to live with being wrong about that. I just had to be patient enough to let it happen. Alicia moved quickly once I gave her everything I had. Within 2 weeks, she had retained a corporate financial investigator to trace the full movement of the $64,800, and she had begun pulling together every document related to Prairie Gate's founding articles of incorporation, original shareholder agreements, property records, tax filings going back to the year I opened the first location. She told me the most important thing we could establish was a clear timeline what existed before the marriage, what had been structured separately, and what Danielle had actually contributed to versus simply lived alongside. That distinction, Alicia said, was going to be the entire case. What I didn't anticipate was how fast Danielle's legal team would move on their end. Her attorney filed an initial disclosure within the first month of proceedings that reframed the last 8 years of my life in a way that was almost impressive in its distortion. The argument was straightforward. Prairie Gate had grown most significantly during the years of the marriage. Therefore, Danielle was entitled to a portion of the system's current value. Her lawyers described it as a marital enterprise, something that had flourished because of the stability the shared household, the emotional infrastructure that a marriage provides. They even included language suggesting Danielle had made career sacrifices to support my professional development, which was a claim so detached from reality that Alicia actually set the document down and looked at me for a moment before continuing. Danielle had worked full-time in brand strategy throughout our entire marriage. She had never attended a Prairie Gate board meeting, reviewed a budget, signed a vendor contract, or spent a single evening helping us prepare for an accreditation review. But the filing didn't need to be accurate. It needed to be sufficient to get a judge's attention, and it was. What Danielle's attorneys actually wanted wasn't operational control of a cardiac care system that would have been absurd, and they knew it. What they wanted was to establish enough legal ambiguity around Prairie Gate's value that I would be forced to either sell a portion of my equity or take on significant debt to buy out whatever claim they could manufacture. Either outcome would have damaged the system in ways that had nothing to do with medicine. Selling equity meant bringing in outside interests who had no stake in patient outcomes. Taking on debt meant stalling the Overland Park expansion, the fifth location we had spent 18 months planning a facility designed specifically to serve patients on the southern end of the metro who currently had to drive nearly an hour each way to reach one of our centers. I kept showing up to work through all of it. I want to be honest about how strange that period was, walking into procedure rooms at 6 in the morning, placing catheters with the same hands that had spent the previous evening reviewing legal documents, making decisions that affected someone's heart rhythm, while my own professional life was being argued over in a law office across town. My team didn't know the full scope of what was happening. My partners knew there was a divorce proceeding, but I had not told them how directly it was targeting Prairie Gate's structure. I didn't want the uncertainty to destabilize them before I had anything concrete to offer. So I kept the weight of it where it had always been, on my own side of the wall. The investigator Alicia had retained was a woman named Mallory Finch. Her background was in tracing money through corporate structures, reconstructing transactions across multiple entities to understand where funds actually came from and where they actually landed. She was precise, she was thorough. And within 3 weeks of beginning her review, she called Alicia with findings that reoriented the entire picture. Alicia relayed it to me on a Thursday evening, and I sat in my home office and listened without interrupting. Colin Vance was not who Danielle believed him to be. The profile he'd built, the wealth management practice, the investment portfolio, the life that looked expensive from every visible angle, was almost entirely constructed from borrowed presentation. His advisory firm had lost 3 major institutional clients the previous year following a compliance review. He was carrying substantial personal debt from a string of failed real estate positions, and there was evidence he had been using incoming client funds to cover obligations that predated those clients' relationships with him. The sports car was leased on a monthly arrangement. The high-rise apartment was owned by a property company that had already initiated legal action against him for unpaid rent. The photographs he circulated of international travel and exclusive events were in nearly every case taken at functions paid for by clients who had since terminated their agreements with him. The $64,800 that Danielle had moved out of our accounts over 10 months had not been invested. Mallory traced it through 3 intermediary accounts before finding where it had actually landed. Roughly $40,000 of it had gone towards settling a debt Colin owed to a private lender. The remainder had been absorbed into his firm's operating account, which was running at a deficit by the time Danielle had made her first transfer. I sat with that information for a long time before I said anything. Danielle had looked at what I built over 14 years and decided it wasn't enough. She had looked at Colin Vance and seen something better. And what she had actually done was take real money that represented real work, and hand it to a man who was using it to keep a fiction alive. She hadn't traded up. She had been deceived by a very polished performance, and she had funded it with our savings without ever asking a single hard question. I didn't feel satisfaction when I understood this. I felt something quieter and more complicated, the recognition that the woman I had built a life with had trusted a stranger's image more completely than she had ever trusted my substance. That said something about the marriage that the divorce filing hadn't fully articulated. Mallory's report also confirmed what Alicia had been working to establish from the beginning. Prairie Gate had been incorporated 2 full years before Danielle and I were married. My founding equity had never been transferred into joint ownership. The 2 buildings held through Prairie Gate Clinical Properties had been acquired through an entity formed prior to the marriage using capital that predated it. The household expenses throughout the marriage had been covered through my salary account, kept entirely separate from the practice's capital and distribution structures. There was no commingling. There was no hidden structure. There was simply a business that had been built, carefully documented thoroughly, and never explained loudly enough for the people sitting across from me at dinner to bother understanding. For the first time since I'd stood in that restaurant hallway, I believed I could protect what I had built. But that belief lasted almost exactly 2 weeks before Colin changed tactics. When it became clear that Danielle's legal team was losing ground on the Prairie Gate valuation argument, Colin introduced something new into the proceedings. A revised valuation report appeared prepared by a firm I didn't recognize, presenting numbers that bore almost no relationship to Prairie Gate's actual financial structure. The document described the system as significantly more valuable than it was on paper by excluding liabilities and misclassifying my premarital equity as a jointly developed asset. More damaging than the numbers themselves was the framing the report characterized Prairie Gate as something I had deliberately obscured from my spouse, suggesting I had structured the business to minimize her legal access to its value. That implication of concealment, not the numbers but the narrative, was the actual weapon. Within days, word had reached 2 of our banking partners and at least 1 member of Prairie Gate's advisory board. Nobody called it credible. Nobody said they believed it. But in institutional finance, an allegation doesn't need to be credible to create caution, and caution is expensive when you're 3 months into a construction timeline. The bank financing our Overland Park facility suspended disbursements pending resolution of the litigation. The contractor pulled his crew from the site. A physician I had spent the better part of 4 months recruiting someone whose specialty would have significantly expanded our arrhythmia management program began returning calls from a hospital on the other side of the city. Danielle moved out of the Brookside house on a Thursday. She had arranged it while I was at the hospital movers a truck and a departure timed so that I would come home to an already completed fact. I stood in the front hallway and looked at the spaces where things had been, and what I felt most was not grief, but a kind of exhausted recognition. This had been over for longer than either of us had formally acknowledged. She called me that evening. I answered because Alicia had told me to keep all communication open and documented. Danielle didn't apologize for Colin, and she didn't apologize for the money. What she said was that I should have told her what Prairie Gate was really worth, that if she had known the full scope of what I owned, things might have gone differently. I listened to the entire statement before I responded. Then I told her that the information had always been available to anyone who wanted to look for it, and that I had never hidden what I was building. I had simply stopped expecting her to be interested in it. She hung up without replying. That night I sat in the glass room at the back of the house in the chair beside the one that had been Bernice's, and I thought about the difference between losing something and letting something go. The marriage was over, but Prairie Gate still existed. The physicians were still there. The patients were still being seen. The Overland Park facility was stalled, not canceled, and Alicia was still working. The next morning, Mallory sent over something she had found during a deeper review of the falsified valuation report. The document's metadata, the internal revision history that most people don't think to check, contained a clear record of edits. Specific figures had been changed after the initial draft. Liabilities had been deleted from a summary table. Language describing my premarital assets had been altered to suggest joint contribution. The edits had been made from a device registered to Colin's firm, and the timestamps placed them well after the report's stated completion date. The report hadn't just been wrong. It had been deliberately altered. Alicia called me as soon as she reviewed Mallory's findings. She said we now had something that went beyond divorce proceedings evidence of intentional misrepresentation submitted to a legal process. She told me to think carefully about how I wanted to use it, because using it fully meant a very public unraveling for everyone involved, including Danielle and Rosalind. I told her I would think about it overnight. I already knew what I was going to say, but I wanted to be sure I was deciding from the right place, not from anger, not from the part of me that still heard Rosalind's voice in that restaurant hallway. I needed to make a choice I could live with afterward when the legal process was finished, and I was still the person who had to run Prairie Gate and show up for the people who depended on it. That was the standard I had always held myself to. I wasn't going to lower it now. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at a law office near Crown Center. I walked in carrying nothing but a leather portfolio that Alicia had given me to hold the documents she would be presenting. She had told me the night before that my job in that room was simple. Say as little as possible and let the paperwork do the work it was designed to do. I had spent 14 years learning that the most consequential moments in a procedure room are often the quietest ones, when the catheter is in position, when the signal is clear, when everything depends on a steady hand and the discipline not to overcorrect. I understood how to be still when stillness was the right instrument. Danielle arrived with her attorney and a bound copy of the falsified valuation report. She was dressed carefully, composed in the way that people are composed when they have rehearsed for something, and she sat across the conference table without looking at me directly. Her attorney opened with a prepared statement that described Prairie Gate as the central asset of a marital partnership, a system that had grown, expanded, and increased in value during 8 years of shared life and in which Danielle had a rightful interest. He used words like contribution and sacrifice and joint trajectory. He referenced the valuation report as an independent professional assessment of the system's worth. He was skilled and measured and almost entirely wrong about the facts. Alicia let him finish without interruption, without objection, without giving any signal that the next hour was going to go differently than Danielle's team expected. When the room turned to her, she opened her own folder and began placing documents on the table, not all at once, but one at a time in a sequence she had organized deliberately. The founding incorporation papers for Prairie Gate came first, dated 2 years before the marriage certificate that followed them. Then the original shareholder agreement with my equity stake, clearly documented as premarital capital. Then the property records for the 2 buildings held through Prairie Gate Clinical Properties, both acquired before Danielle and I had exchanged vows. Then the tax records showing the strict separation between my salary account and the practice's capital structures, the account from which household expenses had been paid for 8 years, kept entirely apart from accounts that had never been commingled with it. Then Alicia placed the transaction records on the table. Every transfer, every date, every destination. $64,800 traced from our joint account through 3 intermediary points to the accounts of a man whose firm was operating at a deficit and whose personal debt had been accumulating for years before Danielle ever wrote him a check. She placed Mallory's profile of Colin alongside it, the leased car, the disputed apartment, the compliance review that had cost him his 3 largest clients, the private lending agreement he had used Danielle's money to partially satisfy. Then she placed the valuation report's metadata analysis on the table. The revision history, the deleted liabilities, the altered language, the timestamps from a device registered to Colin's firm made after the report's stated completion date. And finally, the text message thread. Rosalind, in her own words, advising her daughter to move before Xavier realizes he doesn't have a choice. The room went very quiet. Danielle's attorney asked for a recess without finishing the sentence he'd started. When they came back 12 minutes later, the posture of the entire proceeding had shifted. He no longer led with claims. He asked carefully whether there was a path to resolving the matter that day rather than advancing to litigation. Alicia said there was and outlined the terms she had prepared. Danielle looked at me for the first time since the session had begun. She said she hadn't intended for things to go this far, that it had all become more complicated than she had planned, and that she had never wanted Prairie Gate itself to be damaged. I listened to all of it. Then I told her the truth because I thought she deserved to hear it stated plainly, even if she wasn't going to enjoy it. You didn't just try to take what was mine. You put the work of doctors, nurses, and patients at risk because you decided I was too small to defend myself. That's what I can't set aside, not the money, not the lawyers. The assumption. She didn't respond to that. Her attorney moved the conversation back to settlement terms, which was probably the right professional instinct, even if it was a relief I didn't particularly feel. We reached an agreement before noon. Danielle received her share of the assets that genuinely qualified as marital property, the joint accounts, certain investments accumulated during the marriage, specific household items. The $64,800 was to be returned in full. Prairie Gate. The clinical properties buildings and the Brookside house remained entirely mine, their premarital status now documented so thoroughly that no future proceeding could credibly challenge it. The freeze on Prairie Gate's financial distributions was lifted as part of the settlement. The falsified valuation report and Mallory's findings regarding Colin were referred to the appropriate regulatory bodies to be handled as a separate matter, one I had no further involvement in and no interest in directing. Before we left the room, Danielle asked me one more question. She asked why I had never simply told her family the full scope of what Prairie Gate had become. I thought about the answer for a moment because I wanted it to be accurate rather than pointed. I told you what I was building, I said. Every year for 8 years. You were just too busy deciding what I was to hear what I was saying. I walked out of that building and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold air. I didn't feel like celebrating. What I felt was the specific relief of a man who has been carrying something very heavy and has finally been allowed to set it down, not because the weight turned out to be nothing, but because the road he needed to carry it down was finally behind him. The weeks that followed moved with a momentum I hadn't expected. The bank restored financing for the Overland Park facility within 10 days of the settlement, once the legal freeze had been formally lifted. The construction crew returned to the site the following week. The physician I had spent 4 months recruiting called me personally to say he had made his decision, and that watching how I had handled the preceding months had been part of what made it. He said he wanted to work somewhere that protected its people. I told him we'd see him in 30 days. Colin lost his financial advisory license 6 weeks after the settlement. The regulatory review moved faster than I expected, and the picture it assembled was thorough enough that the outcome wasn't in serious doubt. Danielle had already ended the relationship before the review concluded. The dissolution had been swift and unpleasant, which I imagine is what happens when the fiction that sustained something finally runs out of funding. I didn't follow the details closely. I had made a decision somewhere in that process to stop measuring my progress by what was happening to them, and I intended to keep it. What I focused on instead was something I had been thinking about since the night I sat in Bernice's glass room and looked at her empty chair. I established a scholarship fund through Prairie Gate's foundation arm, the Bernice Lawson Fund, designated for students from working-class families pursuing medical training who lacked the financial foundation to sustain it. The first round of recipients was selected in the spring. I didn't announce it broadly. I signed the paperwork, transferred the initial endowment from my personal account, and asked the foundation director to handle the communication directly with the students. And then 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning, a referral came through from a physician at Mercy Ridge Medical Center. The patient had presented with recurrent syncope, unexplained loss of consciousness, combined with irregular cardiac rhythms and a documented risk profile consistent with ventricular arrhythmia. The referring physician had directed the patient to Prairie Gate, specifically to the founder of the system. The intake coordinator sent me the electronic file before the patient arrived, as was standard procedure. The name on the file was Rosalind Gaines. I read it twice. Then I set the tablet down on my desk and looked out the window for a moment at the Ward Parkway streetscape 3 floors below. I thought about the restaurant hallway. I thought about the specific quality of her voice when she had described what kind of man I was, the certainty in it, the complete absence of curiosity about whether she might be wrong. I thought about Danielle's silence that followed. And then I looked at the electrocardiogram data attached to the referral, which showed a pattern I recognized immediately as something that required attention. The intake coordinator knocked and told me Mrs. Gaines had arrived and was asking to see the physician in charge. I said to bring her up. What I was told afterward was that Rosalind had walked into the Prairie Gate lobby, seen the institutional display on the main wall, the timeline of the system's development, the 4 center locations, the photographs of the physician team, the architectural rendering of the Overland Park facility currently under construction, and had stood there reading it for nearly 3 minutes without moving. The display read at its header, Prairie Gate Heart and Rhythm Institute, founded by Dr. Xavier Lawson. The coordinator said Rosalind had not spoken when she finished reading. She had simply asked to be taken upstairs. She was sitting in the chair outside my office door when I opened it, holding the cardiology file the referring physician had given her, both hands wrapped around it in the way people hold things when they need something to hold. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not diminished exactly, but altered in the way that fear alters people who are unaccustomed to being afraid. She looked up when the door opened and her eyes went to my face with an expression I didn't try to interpret. "Mrs. Gaines," I said, "come in." I sat across from her and reviewed the file in front of her, explaining what the data showed and what it meant in language that was clear without being simplified. The syncope episodes combined with her rhythm profile indicated a need for an electrophysiology study, a procedure that would allow us to map the electrical activity in her heart, identify the source of the dysfunction, and determine the appropriate intervention. It was not a conversation I rushed. Every patient deserved the same standard of explanation regardless of who they were to me outside that room. When I finished, Rosalind was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I was wrong about you." She said it without elaboration, without a story attached to it, just the statement offered plainly, which I thought was probably the most honest thing she had ever said to me. I didn't tell her it was fine because it wasn't entirely, and I didn't think she needed the false comfort. I didn't inventory everything she had said or done that had contributed to what the last several months had cost me. I just told her the truth about how I saw it. "You don't have to understand me to let me do my job." She looked around the office, then at the site plans for the Overland Park facility pinned to the side wall, at the framed photographs of the Prairie Gate team across the years, at the small photograph of Bernice that I kept on the shelf behind my desk, the one taken in the glass room the last winter she was well enough to sit there. Rosalind asked why I had never told the family what Prairie Gate had actually become. I thought about giving her the same answer I had given Danielle in the mediation room. Instead, I gave her the version that was slightly more true. I didn't hide it. People were just too busy deciding who I was to ever ask what I was building. I did not perform her procedure myself. The professional boundary was straightforward. A personal history, this complicated, had no place inside a procedure room, and I had a colleague whose clinical judgment I trusted completely. I transferred her care to him directly with a detailed handover, and I remained available for consultation on her treatment plan throughout. She received the study, the intervention it indicated, and the follow-up monitoring that her profile required. The outcome was good. I want to be precise about why I helped her. It was not because she had earned it. It was not because the months between her birthday dinner and that Tuesday morning had somehow settled the account between us. It was because the standard I held myself to in that building had nothing to do with whether the person across from me deserved my best work. It never had. That was the whole point of the work, that it didn't belong to me to withhold based on how I felt about the person who needed it. In the months that followed, the 5th Prairie Gate Center opened in Overland Park. At the ribbon cutting, I didn't talk about square footage or investment figures or what the system had grown into. I talked about a woman who had driven 47 minutes each way for 3 years to reach the nearest electrophysiology specialist because there hadn't been one closer to where she lived. I talked about the families who shouldn't have to lose someone to a diagnosable, treatable rhythm disorder just because the right facility didn't exist within a reasonable distance. I talked about what the building was actually for. Afterward, I drove home to Brookside. I pulled into the garage, walked through the house I had built and rebuilt with my own hands, and sat down in the glass room at the back in the chair beside the one that had been Bernice's. The garden was dark at that hour, but I knew its shape by memory. I had planted most of it myself. I had lost a marriage to a woman who needed me to be something I wasn't. I had lost a version of the future I had assumed I was building toward. But I had kept the work, the building, the team, and the part of myself that knew the difference between what things look like and what they actually are. Rosalind said I would die broke. She was wrong about the money, but more importantly, she was wrong about the man. And she didn't discover that by watching me succeed. She discovered it by needing me and finding out that I showed up anyway. That's the thing about people who build quietly. They don't need the room to notice. They just keep building, and one day the room walks through the door they built and finally understands. If this story stayed with you, it's probably because you know what it feels like to be underestimated by someone who never thought to look closer. The most valuable things people build are rarely the ones on display. They're in the discipline, the consistency, the choices made when no one is watching. If that resonates with you, I'd love for you to subscribe. I share stories like this one every week, and I don't think you'll want to miss what's coming next.